Network and the International Society for Ecological Economics. My name is Corina Dengler. I'm a feminist ecological economist and degrowth activist based in Bremen, in Germany. And I just finished my PhD project titled Feminist Futures, What Degrowth Learns from the Feminist Critique of Science, Economics and Growth. And I'm hosting this session today together with my colleague Katie Wiese. Hello, Katie, maybe you can wave, who is an Associate Policy Officer for Environmental and Economic Justice at the European Environmental Bureau in Brussels, where she is working at the intersection of environment and gender in policymaking. The two of us are, you hear echoing, okay. I'm trying, give me a second. Is it better now? Okay, yes, great. So sorry for this. So Katie and me are hosting this session as coordination group members of the International Network Feminisms and Degrowth Alliance, in short FADA. I'm going to say something about the network in a minute. And as you all know, the session is called Gender, Livelihood and the Impact of COVID. I think it's a really timely session. Since the pandemic situation, we've seen once again what feminists have long argued, namely that the wealth of nation, as Adam Smith refers to, it's fundamentally built upon the sphere of social reproduction and the labor of care, a sphere which is invisibilized, devalued, and destroyed by our capitalist economic system. So in this session today, we will explore intersectional feminist reflections on COVID-19 and the politics of reproduction, social reproduction, on the care income, and on care as commons in a context of ecological crisis. To do so, we have invited 5 speakers. We will introduce them in more detail later, but I just want to welcome now Anna Save, Susan Paulsen, Selma James, Nina Lopez, and Manuela Zechner. We're really honored to have you here in our session today. So let me give a brief outline of this session. First, I will give you a brief introduction to the Feminisms and Degrowth Alliance before Katie is going to explain the house rules for this session. And subsequently, we'll have 5 mini inputs of 7 to 8 minutes each. So the first one is going to be by Anna Save on the pandemic as an opening for a careful radical transformation. The second one will be by Susan Paulsen on COVID-19 care and masculinities. Selma James is going to talk about the Wages for Housework campaign and the care income. Nina Lopez about the global women's strike and the care income. And Manuela Zechner, the last input, is going to talk about the politics of care and commons in a context of ecological crisis. After those mini inputs, the speakers will briefly have time to react to each other, and then we will go over to the discussion part. So we will have some brief follow-up questions, which Katie and me have prepared before we open up the session for a Q&A session with all of you out there. And Katie will explain in a minute how you're able to raise questions. And then finally, Katie will wrap up the session. So,
hola.
sorry, is there someone, can you mute your microphone maybe? So as you can see, we have prepared a full program for the next 2 hours, and I will start by giving you a brief overview of FADA. So Feminisms and Degrowth Alliance, short FADA, it's a network within the international degrowth community. It was founded at the 2016 5th International Degrowth Conference, which was taking place in Budapest in Hungary. And FADA has the principal aim to make feminist thought and practice an integral part of degrowth scholarship. So we have FADA members really coming from and being located nearly all over the world. And we have an immense variety of activist, academic, and professional backgrounds and diverse experiences in feminisms and/or in degrowth, in both a more theoretical and in a more everyday life perspective. The network mainly operates in form of a mailing list for discussion and project ideas, but there's also a FADA coordination group. As previously mentioned, Katie and me are part of this coordination group, which organizes, for example, this session, but more generally FADA sessions and tracks, for example, in degrowth conferences and other events and other conferences. So we have a project space hosted on degrowth.info, and we have a Twitter account, and we're generally speaking a very open, self-organized and horizontal group of people who you can easily join if maybe after this session you feel like that. So in FADA, we're working on different topics, and we're exchanging thoughts on different topics, for example, on questions like what are the patriarchal roots of the growth paradigm and how does hegemonic masculinity reproduce those patriarchal roots? How can care be organized in a degrowth society? Or what do feminisms and degrowth mean in the context of the majority world, and what can we learn from these experiences? So there's a variety of topics and also activities. Like in the recent months, our activities included the publication of a one-pager and a longer collective statement, Collaborative Feminist Degrowth, Pandemic as an Opening for a Careful Radical Transformation. Anna is going to talk about this later on, with translations to Finnish, French, Greek, Italian, German, Spanish, and Turkish. And moreover, we had various discussion events going on among FADA members, for example, on the care income, on transformations from an everyday life perspective and on ecofascism. And well, censors this event today, and I think that's enough of an introduction right now. And I'll hand over to Katie to briefly explain you the house rules.
Thank you, Corinna. Yes, a warm welcome to our session also from my side. And to ensure that our session is running smoothly, I would just like to start with some general house rules. So first of all, please mute yourself and turn off your camera when you're not speaking, as this might lead to the disruptions of the internet connection or the session itself. Secondly, this is really meant to be an interactive session, so we really welcome your inputs and questions, but please only use the chat box for questions and comments. And if you would like to address your question to a specific speaker, it would be really great if you could add the name of the speaker in capitals in front of your questions. And we also encourage you to send your questions throughout the process, so we will have an eye on the chat box the whole time. As Corinna said, we would like to start now with some inputs from each of our speakers. And I would like to welcome and introduce our first speaker of today, Anna Sabe. Anna is an ecofeminist political economist with a background in environmental sciences and sustainability economics based in Jena, Germany. And just very recently, she submitted her PhD thesis, which is called Appropriation and Externalization as a Basis for Accumulation on the Inside-Outside Relationship of the Capitalist Mode of Production. So a warm congratulations to this, Anna, also from our side. And together with us, Anna is also part of the FADA coordination group. Okay, Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kati. Thank you, Corinna. Can you hear me? Okay, fantastic. So I'm going to talk about a statement that you already mentioned. It's called Pandemic as an Opening for a Careful Radical Transformation. And it is collectively written by 40 members of FADA and was published at the end of April after 6 weeks of coming and writing together. In this statement, we came to view the pandemic as a historical rupture and wrote the statement to highlight that this also opens a window for reworlding. As a recent meme says, there is no going back to normal because normal was the problem. And so as a group of activists and scholars, we took this opportunity to reflect on how we can, from our diverse positions, face this moment and collectively imagine radical alternative modes of living with more time for community relationship building and care for each other and the non-human world. So first, I want to talk a bit about our process and then briefly talk about some aspects of the content of the statement. When the pandemic hit my region in early March, I felt deeply overwhelmed and anxious and profoundly unsure about what there was to do. I remember a particular day when I visited my favorite cafe, attempting to write my dissertation, but everything was different that day. People randomly and hectically repeated the news, and the customers, they suddenly talked to the cafe owners and each other, which can be rare in German society. And it became an open question very soon how we as individuals and how the whole society should react now. And much of the discourse around me in this moment was dominated by securitization, isolation, and the brutality of the attempt to survive as individuals. And the word social distancing became an accidental marker of the societal climate, which turned cold in a matter of hours. This experience might resonate with you. I felt a wave of darkness and violence coming our way, and so when the first messages of FADA members on this topic arrived, I felt super grateful to know that others too are concerned and wonder about adequate feminist responses. Only a few individuals sharing their vulnerability and concern were the starting point for our coming together in this time, and then led to the FADA statement. Crafted by people from different regions and backgrounds, the statement was for us a way of coping, of making meaning when we all felt shaken in one or the other way by the event of the COVID pandemic. When we first gathered in video conferences, we shared personal experiences related to the outbreak and to the following political measures or the lack of them. And the pandemic asked us to learn quickly. How could we help shed light on the arising issues that needed a feminist observation and critique? As an international community, our experiences of these early days of the pandemic were diverse. While in some quarters the policy of staying at home was a major feminist concern because it meant that women could be confined to dangerous homes, in other quarters the pandemic interrupted food commodity chains. So a first challenge of our gatherings was to find ways to speak at all about the terrifying things happening around us. And next, it was our challenge to find mutual understanding about how this crisis plays out in different ways, to then help each other in establishing feminist viewpoints and formulating criticisms that help us politicize those common but very different experiences. And pretty quickly, a second main challenge arose. Not only did we have to find our feminist voice, but also a degrowth position had to be defended. Against the allegation that the recession following the pandemic was somehow a degrowth scenario, we saw the need to clarify once more: economic recessions and depressions are crises, and as such, they are not equitable to careful social transformations. So with our statement, we wanted to clarify at the moment of writing that the crisis is not our degrowth, and that the crisis heightened and keeps increasing already existing social inequalities, and that political measures to combat the pandemic need to be sensitive to gender, race, class, and different health conditions, among other aspects. Additionally, we pointed to several possible paths to move forward to a feminist degrowth situation and explained why the overall situation is an opening. So first, we consider this an opening because it shows the importance of a provisioning economy. In a time where essential jobs are finally recognized as such, a feminist degrowth calls for restructuring of our economies to shift the emphasis from the production of things to feed the growth imperative towards reproduction and towards provisioning of life and meeting needs. The sustainability of life should constitute the main goal for social organization. Second, the pandemic is an opening because it helps acknowledge the home as a site of production and reproduction. When employers expect people to do care work and wage work at the same time without due attention, gender divisions of labor become ever more defined and unequal. And feminist scholars pointed out before, the household has always been a workplace, and the workplace depends on the household, whether or not they are the same place. Third, the pandemic is an opening because it directly confronts us with the heart of the economy, and that is the care economy. In a feminist degrowth future, the provision of care for the community and environmental care will be based on different logics than profit maximization or competition. We therefore call for the socialization of all universal healthcare, the socialization of utilities, and the decommodification of basic services. And fourth, the pandemic is an opening because it highlights interdependence and points towards a solidarity economy. We see the pandemic is offering a vital insight, and that is the true and total interdependence of humans on each other and on the biosphere. And in this interdependence, we need long-term structural solutions to protect those who are vulnerable. This implies that this care-based crisis, for example, can't be solved by mass incarceration or the closure of national borders. Degrowth is about planetary thresholds, not borders. In sum, we need an economics and economies based in care, stewardship, cooperation, sharing, and commoning. For industrialized societies, this must include social and environmental justice that makes up for centuries of coloniality and plunder. Such a project of transforming the present, thanks Kati, and to engage in an emancipatory practice of worlding is ongoing. Since we published this statement, so many people have resisted against the wider societal causes and socially highly unequal effects of the pandemic. While we demand a more careful world, others, for example, demand the right to breathe and the protection of Black lives. And we hope to be allies in this struggle. To conclude, let me say that the question, where do we go from here, is of the essence in a time when governments all over the world invest heavily in stimulating growth and in this effort once more prescribe the capitalist mode of production as the quick fix for this profound socio-ecological crisis, which should point our eyes in a very different direction. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Anna, for this very insightful elaborations. Richard was asking for the link for the FADA statements. I posted them to the chat. Thank you, Anna, for your input. And I'm now handing over to Susan. Susan Paulson is based at the University of Florida, and she studies and teaches about gender, class, and ethno-racial systems interacting with bodies and environments. She has researched and taught in Latin America for over 30 years, 15 of those living in South America among low-income, low-impact communities. Recent writings of her include, for example, Degrowth, Culture, Power, and Change, and also pluriversal learning, pathways to a world of many worlds. Susan has also worked a lot on COVID and also masculinities, and she's been very active in all our past FADA activities. Susan, it's really an honor to have you here too. I'm handing over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Karina, Katie, for nurturing these feminist explorations. In every society, provisioning and care, as well as vulnerabilities to harm, are organized through economic systems, also kinship systems, other institutions, including gender. Recently, I reviewed 35 articles about gender and COVID and was delighted to see perspectives ranging from women's empowerment to degrowth, feminism, what we already heard a little bit about. I was disappointed to find almost nothing about masculinities or LGBTQ. Transformations sought by ecological economics and degrowth require motivating people in every identity position to forge gender systems that are healthier for themselves, for differently positioned others, and for other nature. They also require us to recognize that gender intersects with economic, ethno-racial, and other differences at every turn. One example is gender-based violence. It's widely observed that women suffer a disproportionate share of domestic violence, which seems to have increased during the pandemic. I'm just going to put up some slides here. We see that? What about gender-based violence against men? In the Americas, the World Health Organization reports that men are victims of nearly 90% of homicides, 70% of suicides, and 95% of occupational deaths. Hold on, I try to get my next slide. There we go. It turns out that COVID impacts are also highly gendered. It seems that men have about twice as much risk of death as women. Evidence that poor non-white men are the most vulnerable should draw our attention to occupations, identities, and places. Most of the gender COVID publications point out that women working as nurses and health aides are vulnerable to infection. So too are millions of men who perform essential jobs in every world region. Sanitation workers, meat packers, food harvesters, truck and bus drivers are just as essential to public health. And these were already among the most dangerous and deadly occupations before adding exposure to coronavirus. We just convinced ourselves that certain types of men, it's natural that they are exposed to danger and to harm. Women, on average, outlive men in every country by as many as 13 years. Factors include lifestyle, diet, attitudes to healthcare, limited social connections, biology, and risk-taking. All these are relevant for COVID and also for reshaping economy and livelihood after COVID. In terms of risk, studies have found men twice as likely as women to go without masks to break quarantine. So is it helpful to say it's their own fault that they got sick? We've learned to have compassion for women whose conditions lead to lack of self-esteem, financial skills, or initiative necessary to make dignified lives for themselves. Can we feel compassion for boys and men whose conditions and expectations push them to demonstrate virility by taking risks or by enduring and exercising violence? Many public health messages, and including many feminist publications, assume that everyone lives in heteronormative nuclear households. Stay home with your family. Women are burdened with more housework than their husbands. In the US, only 20% of households are nuclear families. Many people don't even live in households. Long-term care centers tend to house more women because they live longer, but men make up big majorities in migrant working camps, homeless shelters, jails, prisons, immigrant detention centers, military barracks, all hotspots for contagion. The portrayal of one family model in public health limits our well-being because it does not reflect empirical realities, which are plural, but it also reinforces normative messages that demean other life ways. For example, in many countries, most common household type is a single person living alone. That's 20% of US and Canadian households, 40% of Swedish households. I did find one slide that reflected that. So we need to support existing diverse identities and arrangements for caring and for social reproduction, and also innovations that are provoked by challenges, including COVID. One innovation that I love are queer virtual dance parties like Club Quarantine, where people around the world can get together and share pleasure and identity even from their own homes. So in conclusion, COVID realities strengthen the case for expanding gender analysis beyond women's need to pay attention to all identities and relations relevant for pandemic responses and for transformations toward healthier worlds. That shift is relevant for this conference because goals of ecological economics and degrowth are undermined by gender discourses that reproduce historical forms at the heart of exploitative growth. Masculinities as well as femininities have been harnessed to growth, have been harnessed to historic mode of production based in a hierarchical divorce between market production and reproduction. This mode, there we go. This mode has adapted to facilitate an astonishing expansion of industrial economies and ecological footprints. So liberal feminisms have often tried to move some women into productivist roles without questioning the basic model. That certainly empowered some women. It's definitely helped in large economies, but it's not brought about the transformations that we seek towards more caring and regenerative worlds. Cultural politics, like you see in this slide, make this mode seem natural and universal since prehistory to the supersonic future. Men sell their labor, women take after reproduction, etc. But our scholarship and activism requires different approaches. Currently, reproductive and care work are excluded from most economic analyses and initiatives. Masculinities and men's work are excluded from most gender analyses and initiatives. So I leave you with a simple strategy to better engage integral realities. First, let's recognize all kinds of gender identities and relations that actually exist, motivate all kinds of people to experiment with and benefit from more equitable and regenerative systems, and broaden horizons of innovations by looking beyond dominant norms. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Thanks a lot for your inputs on COVID care and masculinities. I would then now would like to continue with Selma James, who is a women's rights, anti-racist, and anti-capitalist campaigner and author. In 1972, she founded the International Wages for Housework campaign, and in 2000, she also helped launching the global women's strike, whose strategy for change is to invest in caring, not killing. She also co-authored the classic The Power of Woman and the Subversion of the Community in 1972, and her anthology Sex, Race and Class, The Perspective of Winning was published in 2012. And the second anthology, Our Time is Now, Sex, Race, Class and Caring for People and Planet, will be published next year in 2021. She's also contributed to the Green New Deal for Europe. Selma, it's an honor to have you, and the floor is yours.
What's on mute? Oh, I was thanking you. We are on mute. Thank you very much for your lovely introduction. And I'm very happy to be on this. First of all, we're new to the feminisms that you describe, but we feel confident that we're definitely on the same track, and we are opposed to further capitalist growth and bringing together more wealth in smaller and smaller places. I want to speak about the care income, but first I must say that the universality of care now, we can say that easily because the pandemic had made it absolutely clear that our lives depend on that care. And not only when there is the pandemic which threatens health, but when there is a pandemic, as there is now, of poverty and of ecological devastation, etc., we are threatened in many ways, and care is the best way we have, except for organizing ourselves, which defend us and protect us, all of us of every age. Now, of course, the care that we give is absolutely central to capital, but is not paid attention to by capital, not paid for it, not even most of the time noticed. It's taken for granted, like the trees and like the rest of the natural world. And we, as a result, are dependent and we are poor. And we try very hard to do something about that situation. Now, when we came to the conclusion that we wanted to demand a wage for housework, we looked around. We weren't conscious that we were doing that, but we looked around to find out if that's what women had been struggling for. Because if you have the right political perspective, then millions are working on it in a quiet and unrecognized way. And what we found immediately was that first there was a mass movement of women for welfare in the United States in the 60s and 70s, and continues to this day in small measure, although it's been defeated by the state. It's led by Black women, but in the countryside, it's mainly white women who benefit from it and fight for it. But the strugglers, the people in front, the people who led it and spearheaded it were women from the Black community, and they were all single mothers, which meant not only that single mothers had an income, but that single mothers were an option. that is a possibility for other women as well. Thanks, Neen. Let me see my notes. We have that in common, the universality of care, but we also have great divisions among us. First of all, of race, and there are many races, of language, of disability, of immigration status, of how little we are paid. We are all paid less than we should be, or most of us are, but some of us are paid more or less than others. And at the same time, we have the universality. So on the one hand, we have a reason to be together. On the other hand, we are being torn apart. And when you want to organize, as we do, we were none of us based at a university. We were all grassroots in one way or another. And when you want to organize, you want to find out how to do it, how to bring together what we have in common, what would bring us together, which we have in common, but also how to overcome the divisions. We found two solutions to that. One of them was that you organize on all questions of getting money for women, or where women are being undermined by the fact that they don't have money, and therefore you fight on the injustices that result from lack of money. And in the organization itself, you base yourself on autonomy, so that every sector, the woman who is fighting for the right to remain in Britain or the US or anywhere, and the woman who has disabilities, and the woman who is older, and the single mother, etc. Every single one of the women who wants to find herself in that struggle, and at the same time being connected with other women, she has the right and the possibility of having an autonomous organization within the struggle for wages for housework. And when you have an international network, as we absolutely began with, you see a much wider variety of women's struggles that you incorporate into whatever you are struggling for. So you have a wide degree of issues that are part of you and that you are part of, while at the same time able to concentrate on your own issue. That has been a crucial part of the way we have organized, and how wages for housework has been a unifying entity, but at the same time make sure that nobody's struggle is undermined or demeaned. Now, when we heard of the care income, by the way, I didn't mention any other struggle but the one in the US for welfare. In the UK, for example, and in other countries, there was fight for family allowance, and we won. I must speak quickly. The care income put together what we assume to be two different movements: the movement for the environment to save us and for the planet, and the other movement for the liberation of women, beginning with the spearhead of wages for housework. And when we looked at our international network, most of the women were involved in one way or another, either by family or directly, as trying to save the soil and the water, and in every way, they were part of the ecology movement. So instead of being two movements, there really was one: the liberation of women and the care for the environment. One of the slogans of one group of women in Thailand was, "We care as much for the soil as we do for our families." Now, that makes an entirely different power to every demand that you make. I'll mention only two things. The first is the Poor People's Campaign in the United States, which is a growing movement from the bottom up of people who are poor and who are speaking about their experience and not having others speak for them. And they have embraced the care income. They have also organized in a pattern of fusion, that is, that everyone comes in with their own demands, their own issues, and everyone else incorporates that. I feel there's a lot of hope there, which we don't always hear about. The second is that we issued an open letter on the care income, which not only they have embraced, but which many others are now incorporating into what they are doing and signing it. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Selma, for those elaborations. It's really great. It's really an honor to have you here. And I want to hand over to the next speaker, Nina Lopez, who's sitting right next to you, if I'm getting this right. Hello, Nina. Nina Lopez, she is originally from Argentina. She is a joint coordinator with Selma James on the Global Women's Strike. She contributed to and edited the book Some Mother's Daughters, A Hidden Movement of Prostitute Women Against Violence in 1998, Creating a Caring Economy, Nora Castañeda and the Women's Development Bank of Venezuela in 2006, and The Perspective of Caring in 2016. She's also, together with Selma James and also Giacomo D'Alisa and Stefania Barca from the Degrowth Movement, a contributor to the Green New Deal for Europe. Thank you, Nina, for being here, for talking to us, and I'm handing over to you.
Great, a great pleasure. And we have to thank Stefania for introducing us to your network, which we're very pleased to be now a part of. I wanted to give some examples of how our network, our International Global Women's Strike Network, which Selma mentioned, how it responded to the care income. Because as Selma said, when you're making a demand or you're putting something forward, really the proof is, do people really want it? Are they ready to fight for it? Do they find that that's a unifying struggle that they can make for what you're putting forward? And the response to the care income within our grassroots network was fantastic. People, despite the fact that it started as a proposal that came from Europe, we immediately put it forward as a universal application. We said the care income has to be global. And people immediately looked at how it would help their situation. I want to start, first of all, with mentioning the domestic worker trade union in Peru, in Lima, Peru, but it's all over the country, which is part of our network and has been for many years. They are fighting, as they always point out, we work in our home and we work in the home of others. We campaign for legislation based on the ILO convention, which they won some years ago, which gives domestic workers rights, basically. But at the same time, they're campaigning for a care income, for a living wage. And they point out, for example, that many of the domestic workers come from the rural areas, from indigenous communities to work in the city, and are doing a number of jobs in order to be able to feed their families. And that they are making time for other people. They're creating time for their employers to go out to work, to pursue their careers. But they themselves have no time. And a care income would enable them not to have to do 2, 3, and 4 jobs and to be able to spend time with their children, as opposed to always be looking after the children of others. So they feel that the two things would be really, the two things they're fighting for are really one. And they say a care income could stop us having to do the triple day. Now, our network in Thailand embraces a number of organizations. One of them is Empower, which is a sex worker organization. But the others are a whole set of organizations that are women human rights defenders that are working in a number of communities to save the land from mining, for example, or from plantations, etc., in the slums in many areas. And they, again, immediately worked out what a care income would mean for them in each situation. And they're trying to get that included in the Constitution. I'm sure you've seen on the television, there's very big mobilizations in Thailand at the moment. But before that happened, there was a push to get a new constitution, and people at the grassroots were working on what they wanted in that constitution. And for example, the anti-mining community, one of the anti-mining communities, one of the women describes the work she does. She says, I wake at 2 o'clock in the morning. She does some tapping of rubber from the trees in order to get some money. She campaigns against the mining company, which is poisoning the local water and the soil. She looks after her family. She goes to bed at 9 o'clock in the evening, and she says, that is the time where I worry. I worry about the poison from the mines. I worry about our debts. I worry about going to prison for my anti-mining activities. What would a care income mean to me? Some people say time is money, and this money would give me time. Time to grow more food, time with my husband and daughter, time to strengthen the resistance to mining and other injustices. My family and our community would be secure, and security brings dignity and freedom. Another woman who is a coordinator of the women who live in the slums in Bangkok. She's from the biggest slum in Bangkok, and they represent millions of people. Okay, she's a single mother of 2 children with disabilities. She also has her elderly mother living with her. She's a motorcycle taxi driver in order to earn a little income. She sells sticky rice and pork outside the school that her daughter goes to in the morning in order to, again, make a bit more of an income. And in addition to that, she is the unpaid chairperson of the slum network. So she does a whole set of organizing work. And again, she says a care income would be a secure foundation for me. It would mean I could do more work of caring for my daughter and the community. Paying us a wage in cash or in housing, you have to understand these are slums, so housing is obviously the issue, would mean that we could solve many of the problems of the slums and of the poverty ourselves. We don't lack capacity, we lack money. And I think that they are really speaking for a lot of grassroots people all around the world. Now, I have 2 more examples. One of them is Ireland. In Ireland, Ireland has a constitution from 1937, which acknowledges the caring work of women in the home. Now, because the language is very outdated and sexist, you know, it is put in terms of your duty as a woman at home, that kind of thing. Some feminists have wanted to remove the article from the Constitution altogether. We have pointed out that this would not be an improvement because it's the only recognition of caring work that actually exists in the Constitution. And also it says that the state has an obligation, has a responsibility to family caregivers, which is path-breaking for a constitution. There are not many in the world who acknowledge that. So we have been fighting in Ireland to make sure that instead of abolishing the recognition, it is updated so that it recognizes all the caring work that goes on within the family and the state responsibility towards carers. And also that caring should not be used to undermine you when you go out to work and to pay you less because you have caring responsibilities and therefore you're not as available as they would like you to be. And the care income has given real impetus to the struggle to get the Constitution to be amended in a way that really reflects where we are at as women, as the caregivers, as those who have been struggling for recognition. And also that all genders who do caring work should be included in that definition. Now, finally, I have 1 minute and I want to mention the United States, which is an important part of our network, where policymakers have begun to acknowledge that mothers and other on-wage primary caregivers are also essential workers. You know, everybody's talking about essential workers now. The lowest paid, it turns out, the essential ones. What else is new? And so there is a congresswoman, a Black woman who was herself a single mother on welfare for some years and therefore knows the issue of poverty from personal experience, who is putting forward a bill that would redefine workers to include unpaid family caregivers as well as students. Okay, so that is a real breakthrough. It's not called a care income, but a care income will, again, this could be a part of what a care income is, and the fight for a care income will give it great impetus. There are many sectors in our networks who see the care income as crucial to them. Sex workers, for example, can see that if you're going into sex work because of poverty as a single mother, if you had a care income, that could really change your life. So I won't mention any more because my time is up. But that gives you a sense of how different sectors and different countries are responding to the care income.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you for your insights. I would then like to continue with our last speaker, who is Manuela Zechner. She's a researcher, a culture worker, and a facilitator working across the arts, academia, and social movements. And her work focuses on subjectivity and micropolitics as a matter of imagination, relation, and the organization in feminist, anti-capitalist, anti-colonial, and ecological struggles. Her most recent postdoc research project focused on childcare commons and the micropolitics of municipalism in Barcelona, which was a part of the heteropolitics ERC project at Aristotle University Thessaloniki. And she's also currently a fellow at the Institute for the Futures of Sustainability at Hamburg University in Germany. And together with about 40 other school activists, Manuela has also contributed to the FADA collective statement. Welcome, Manuela.
Hi. Can you hear me well? Good. Thanks very much. Sorry, this biography reads very long. Thanks very much. It's really a pleasure and honor to be on the panel. It's kind of hard to follow up with something after all these amazing inputs. And I'm afraid, or maybe it's good news, I'm not sure, but what I prepared is rather kind of conceptual. So we're going now from the very, very concrete to something a bit more abstract and conceptual. I'll try and keep it brief, and I hope it will be useful maybe for some of the debates afterwards. Basically, what I would like to share is some thoughts going back to care ethics and some of the core concepts of Joan Tronto's work, and to think those through in relation to the ecological and climate crisis and how we relate to care today somehow. And that will also obviously be hopefully useful for thinking about about degrowth and questions of masculinity and the COVID crisis, which, you know, there's a lot to say about all that, but I'm going to keep it quite specific on this. So many of you will be familiar with this kind of way that Joan Tronto talks about care ethics and about different phases of care. I'm just going to repeat it very briefly in case you've never heard of it. But the idea is that there are different kind of different aspects or phases to care which relate to one another. 4 of them, which have been kind of most explicitly spoken about in the book Moral Boundaries by Joanne Tronto, and that was published in 92-93, are caring about, taking care of, caregiving, and care receiving. And so in a really quick nutshell, the idea is that caring about is the moment that is more about having a worry or a concern about somebody, recognizing that there is a need somewhere. So it's a more kind of, you could say, mental to some extent or perceptive moment in care, which is very crucial because you see that there is a need that needs to be addressed. Taking care of is when that becomes a little bit more kind of practice-based, and when there is a gesture or a move to address that need that has been perceived. So this would be like a second phase of care. Slightly more practical, but can still be sporadic, a kind of a single gesture or something like this. Caregiving is then what we've been talking about with the care income and so on, is the labor of care, the kind of sustained everyday, you know, work of care, which is also very bodily and physical in a lot of senses. Work that is largely been done by women historically, by slaves, you know, by migrants, etc. Work that is generally undervalued. There's a whole analysis of that I will go into a little bit in a minute. And then the 4th level would be care receiving. So there's this key issue that the key notion that it's very important to recognize ourselves as subjects that also receive care. We are never fully autonomous or independent. And as long as we live with this idea of the self-made man, you know, or of needs as being something that some people have and others don't, we are bound to kind of misunderstand and not be able to produce a kind of more integral process of care. So with these 4 things in mind, I've been thinking a lot recently about how I see people and also campaigns and social movements relate to the climate and ecological crisis on social media. Generally, let's say this is a kind of viewpoint that comes more from, I think, movements that have some visibility in industrialized countries, etc., where I think we see a lot of expressions of worry and concern. So the 1st level of care, which is caring about, is something that gets a lot of space on social media, with people, you know, expressing anxiety, worry about the, you know, coming disasters, etc. Expressions of anger, of fear, circulating reports, circulating stories on WhatsApp. There's also been a lot of declarations of climate emergency, which I think is also something that falls in this 1st level of care, which is, you know, the moment of expressing a concern, but not necessarily acting upon it. I think if we think of coronavirus, the applauding of essential workers is also something that goes in this, is part of this moment of caring about as a 1st moment of care that is somewhat disembodied and more of an expression or a gesture. You know, people standing on their balconies and applauding the nurses and doctors and so on. And so I think we see a lot of that. And then we have the 2nd level of care if we think about taking care of, which in Tronto's analysis is associated with masculinity usually. There's this notion that a man, by working a wage job, takes care of his family. You know, there's a lot of ways in which taking care of, you know, the doctor might be seen as taking care of the patient while the nurse is doing all the continuous work, or the lab technicians or whoever, but they remain invisible. So there's a lot of hierarchies between these different phases of care, and they are associated to different kinds of subjects. So when we think about taking care of with the ecological and climate crisis, I think one key thing is these techno fixes or quick fixes that are presented. So the idea that, you know, the climate crisis can be taken care of by certain kinds of technologies. I think with the COVID crisis, it's a similar story with the vaccine. So there is like one kind of subjective outlook or kind of notion of how we are to care about this crisis, which is to do with more quick fixes. Ethical consumption is also a mode of kind of relating to an issue through taking care of, like a single gesture or move or an act of buying or something like that, but that doesn't quite result in a sustained practice or labor. obviously going to protests, making donations, signing petitions. These are also ways of like taking care of kind of trying to relate to this crisis in that modality of an action or something like that, which however doesn't necessarily become sustained. So the question I kind of wanted to raise is, what about the sustained labors and practices that allow us to address the current ecological and climate crisis? This is obviously where commons and commoning would come in. You know, where are those practices? Because I think, you know, if maybe for some people speaking about degrowth, it's appealing because maybe it gives you this idea that there is about a kind of conceptual quick fix, in the sense that, you know, you just take growth out of the economy and then you have the fix. Actually, I guess degrowth is about practices and labors and about a multiplicity and diversity of those. And it's really hard work in that sense. So it's not at all clear what it means. And I guess it's not at all a quick fix, at least in a feminist understanding, I would say. So like, what are these practices that allow us to focus on different kinds of rhythms and generational processes also in relation to different kinds of bodies? And here, something I wanted to raise is something that you see in kind of contemporary care ethics, for instance, in the work of Maria Puig de la Bella Casa, also where the subject of care is not necessarily a human subject, but it's about thinking about more than human subjects. So what if we think about caregiving and care receiving in relation to other forms of life, you know, and other species and so on? So I think this is like one of the major challenges that we are beginning to address and have to address somehow when we think about an ethics of care that can allow us to address kind of climate and ecological crisis. And then another aspect in relation to care receiving that I think is being addressed a lot by all kinds of movements right now that put vulnerability at the forefront is this idea that you know, we all have needs actually, and we have to depart from a logic of interdependence and value mutual vulnerability in these crises. So this is something that has become very visible, both in the climate crisis, you know, with its recent years of very high media coverage and debate and so on. And I think also in the COVID crisis, that is something that is starting to be teased out, and that's very promising in the sense of allowing us to go beyond this, you know, the male independent subject, which is the subject of politics, the subject of law, like these kind of foundations that are based in this myth of autonomy are starting to be undone by all kinds of movements. And then just one last thing I wanted to mention is Toronto has later on added this idea of caring with as another really important level of care. And that's about sort of solidarity and struggling with others. So I just wanted to add that as a point or a question also. So it's like, what are the practices of association and joint struggle, a struggle to defend, but also to invent, you know, that we're seeing emerge through these multiple crises that are coinciding right now. And what new forms of global but also local solidarity do we see emerge? And I mean, I haven't thought a lot about this in relation to the COVID crisis. I think there's a lot to be said, but one thing that certainly appears to me is that at the local level, caring with, I've seen a lot of incredible new practices of neighborhood solidarity emerge. For instance, I was in Barcelona when the pandemic kind of broke out, and now I'm in Vienna. But I've seen kind of new kinds of fabrics of mutual support and interdependence be kind of activated or reinvented that were incredibly promising, and that I think are really important sides to have in mind for struggles also. Yeah, so as a kind of broad conceptual framework that we can draw on, I hope it doesn't mess too much with all these different inputs that have been mentioned. But I'm finding this so rich to come back to and to kind of think about different modes of power and social division, because Toronto's analysis goes very much in depth with thinking about, you know, class, race, gender, and how care is not the same for everybody. So I think we can use that also to think in relation to current challenges. Yeah, but to kind of look at the modes of subjectivity that are kind of emerging. Usually I would present this in the framework of workshops, because I do these care network mapping workshops with groups and collectives, where this becomes a kind of part of a self-analytical tools in social movements and so on. So I don't know what effect it has on a panel, but yeah, that's what I wanted to share.
Thank you, Manuela. Thank you very much for your conceptual insights, but also your experience and also your food for thought, which maybe also the others will react to. Because now we wanted to give our speakers also some time to react to each other. So every one of you will have now 5 minutes to react. And in the meantime, for our participants, please feel free to use the chat box for further questions. We will write them down and we will address them afterwards. So maybe we can just start then with the order that we had before and start with Anna. So maybe Anna, you have your 5 minutes to react, or if you would like to react to what the others have been saying.
Yeah. Yeah, I love to react to what the others have been saying, because it was also interesting and also nourishing. To me, the question of this panel really is how to create livelihoods despite and within the COVID pandemic and the following crisis. And I think our conversation so far has pointed to the importance of connecting struggles and looking for themes or common ground that might be unifying. And maybe we can discuss more when does this unification, this aim to connect the struggles, maybe produce contradictions or tensions, because yeah, this might be fruitful, and this also might be a battleground where environmental concerns and feminist concerns or anti-racist concerns are played out against each other, and it might be ours to disentangle this and not make it as much of a contradiction as maybe other people in power would like us to believe. So I was happy to hear from Selma that the liberation of women and environmental concerns have been a joint issue in the past, and they continue to be joint issues also today. I personally see it as a challenge to connect those, not intellectually, that is easily done, for example, via looking at the environment and care work as devalued and invisibilized at the same time. And also practically, these are connected, but politically, they still have to be connected more, and this has to be recuperated. And the voices that Nina brought to the table really show the importance of this connection. And I think under the pandemic, the recognition of care work is well underway, but recognition alone, or like a bouquet of flowers alone, is not enough, and we need redistribution. The question is how. One part of the answer of this to this question is a care income. The question remains, where do the financial means come from? Maybe through the state, and then looking at different contexts, where exactly in the state does the money come from? I think this needs to be more of a very open and public discussion, because it is now the moment to come from recognition to really action. And also a question that I will remember from this conversation is how to caring with. So how do we do that? And yeah, and for me, as working in the intersection between feminisms and degrowth, I think it will be fruitful to remind everyone that the path to degrowth is hard and sustained work, which is not attractive, but it is much more, it leaves much more opportunities for an emancipatory worlding than technological quick fixes. And so thanks very much, Manuela, for reminding us of that.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you for all the thoughts you had and your reaction to the others. Then I would like to continue with Susan.
Thank you. What a great synergy amongst all of these ideas. One, Nina, Selma, and Manu all talked about caring and caregiving in new ways. And I want to reflect a little bit about human history. it seems across culture and through the historical record and archaeological record, there's been a huge diversity of ways for humans to organize themselves. But in almost all cases, all the different identities have been quite directly focused on caring for the well-being of their kinship group and reproducing humans, creating socialized humans. It's obviously there's exceptions of people who were slaves, whatever, they were not permitted to do that. It's really quite recent and sort of the rise of market capitalism that this idea that caring or being human was about selling your labor to somebody else, right? That became the definition of manliness in many of our cultures. Manu acknowledged that men are now expected to do caring by actually being a breadwinner. And so I'm thinking about what are the contradictions when caring for people by breadwinning requires selling your labor at extremely exploitative conditions in which they're harmful to yourself and to the environment, right? What are those deep contradictions of caring? I care for my family by doing harm to myself and to the environment, right? Working that out seems really difficult. So I go find inspiration by Nina and Selma, who are talking about caregiving as essential work and reevaluating it with money, but also reevaluating it through new significations, right? And I think that is something that class and gender differences can really benefit from that kind of thinking. And I actually just wanted to make one more comment about Bina Garwal made a great chat message about that highlights the importance of intersectionality, how deeply socioeconomic, ethnic, class differences intersect with gender. She mentioned the issue of, in India, mostly men doctors getting PPE and women nurses not getting PPE. It's interesting that in some cultures of hegemonic masculinity, the icon of man is men doctors. Far more men are sanitation workers and farmers and other things. They didn't get PPE and they're already suffering very high danger. In fact, sanitation workers, I think, are just as important as doctors for public health. And they have amongst the highest levels of occupational death of anyone, right? And so there's this question, oh yeah, men get everything because doctors got the PPE, but we have to look, doctors aren't the only men out there, right? We can use socioeconomic and ethnic difference to understand that there's diverse kinds of men that play different roles, right? So I thought that was a really nice sort of comment that highlighted how intersectionality works in vulnerabilities and in public recognition of some roles and not others. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Yeah, then we can continue with Selma and Nina. And Nina, when you're speaking, maybe you can also quickly address one question, because you talked about the US Congress woman, and one of our participants asked who that was or what the name of the Congresswoman was. Thank you.
You want to start?
No, you start.
Okay, there were just some quick points. I was astonished, I don't know why, it should be by now, at the sexism of how many of the men and the women in relation to their caring and frontline and all the rest. And it helps a great deal if you have an organization of men that you work with, which we do. They support our work. They have independent work from us. They work with prisoners. They work with men and women who refuse to go into the army, and they support the work that we do, and they absolutely are with the care income, and their name is Payday if people are interested. But I want to point something else out. This is going on, this sexism, this lack of pay equity, all the things that are, the 3 women a week who are being murdered in the UK, goes on when women have become prime ministers. One is running for vice president of the United States. We have not very much benefited from those women who have gone up. The class line among us has been reinforced, and we have got very little from pushing women up. That's just one thing that I really feel we must all be aware of, and we must all consider how to deal with it, because it is a very serious problem when the perspective of the women's movement is to go up one by one rather than eliminating the bottom, so there's nobody down here, nobody under us, and nobody above us, which is what we formed the women's movement originally to establish. The second thing is about caring. Sorry, I'm getting direction to look ahead. The important work of caring, aside from many things that we do, is that we protect. And it is a highly political function. If when we visited, not St. Louis, the place near it, Ferguson, the Black women had a meeting, about 6 or 8 of them, for women generally, that means for white women, to talk about how they prepared their male children, especially male children, to deal with the police. And I understand that about 200 women turned up to find out. And one of the women who was asked to speak said, "But I don't do that." And they said, "I think you probably do." And she went home and asked her sons, and they said, "You talk about it all the time. You're always telling us how to be." That work of protection, of fighting racism in the schools, of getting the police out of the schools, of seeing that your daughter is not raped, all of that protective work, the further down you get into the social, the economic scale, the more urgent is your protection, your need to protect your children, your mother, from the doctors who's elderly, etc. There are all kinds of work that the protection goes, it is a political function, and it is a crucial part of caring. There was one other thing. Yes, when I spoke, I didn't make absolutely clear that we thought that the ecological movement and the movement for our liberation were two movements, and the women in the global South made clear that there is no such distinction for the lives that they live, and therefore this is the first chance that we get, probably in the history of the world, for the rural and the urban on an international level to organize together. It's an opportunity, and it's very urgent.
To that. Okay, yes, there was a question about who the congresswoman was. The congresswoman we've been working with, her name is Gwen Moore. She's a Democrat, and she's doing this bill with another woman who's called Marcia Fudge. So there's two of them, and we can put up the information, and you can look it all up. I just wanted to first of all, I was astonished by one statistic that Susan mentioned, which said that 20% of households in the US are nuclear families, which I didn't know it was that. I didn't know it was that low. And I don't know if you meant in terms of whether people are married or stuff like that, or if you literally mean, a man and a woman and children. But of course, we knew that, we all know that, and we all are in many different kinds of families. But I didn't know it was now that small. You wouldn't think that from the way the politicians talk about things. I wanted to mention one thing in relation to where is the money to come from, which somebody mentioned, because, the astonishing thing about COVID is that they found money without any problem.
Right.
And in fact, this is what happens every time they want to have a war. And I suppose they did treat COVID like a kind of war. Every time they want to go to war, when they wanted to go to war in Afghanistan, Iraq, which they had no good reason to do, there was no emergency, but they decided it was, and money was not an issue. I mean, the money was just there for the taking. It was the most extraordinary thing. But if you're talking about caring, you're talking about hospitals, you're talking about protective equipment so people who are providing the care don't die, then the money's not there. Somehow, the money doesn't materialize. So it is always a question of political priorities. You know, they find money to destroy the planet and amuse themselves as they do it. And we have a huge struggle in our hands to reverse that so that we can get our hands on that money so that it is used for what it should be used for, which is to protect life, and that is the planet. You know, it's not a distinction that we can make, and people know that now. And to end with all these wars that somehow they always have money for. You know, the ecological movement, I think, is finally beginning to acknowledge that war is, in fact, the worst polluter.
Yes.
If you look at, first of all, the pollution that the Pentagon creates, the Pentagon is the worst polluter in the world by itself. But if you look at what has happened as a result of their war in Iraq and in Afghanistan and the absolute destruction of whole areas of the world, which are not, you know, it's horrendous for those areas in particular, and all the people and the animals and the everything that have died. But also what remains that you then have to deal with, you know, this environment that's just not fit for anybody's habitation, but also the price that the whole thing is paid for all over the world, because we do know it's one world ultimately and one climate. So, you know, we know that it's, you know, we're not kidding ourselves that by imagining a different future, we can actually get there. Because the fact is, you know, there's Trump election coming up. We have Boris Johnson here. There are many right-wing governments around the world who not only don't care about, there's Zionism and what Israel is doing to the Palestinians with the US. So, you know, there are many, we know, and Black Lives Matter has put the police on the agenda.
Indeed, yes.
Again, in a really fantastic way, and we've been involved in all that. So we know that climate justice goes together with social justice, goes together with economic justice. You know, we now, I think more and more people know that it's now one struggle.
Thank you, Selma. Thank you, Nina, for your reactions, and also the context or with what's happening at the moment politically. Then I would lastly like to give the floor to Manuela for some reactions.
Okay. I mostly have questions.
Don't disappear on the screen.
To Susan, but I wanted to say to Anna also, thanks very much for the input, and I'm also so curious actually, because I couldn't be part of these FADA Skypes on the rise of the far right, etc. I'd actually be super curious to hear some of the key conclusions, if any of this comes to mind, or maybe you can also point people to transcriptions or something like that, because I think these sounded incredibly rich, these sessions. And of course, I was wondering in relation to what you were saying, you know, whether you might have seen new forms of solidarity emerge through the COVID crisis, but maybe that's too large a question to answer. But I think it's really interesting to try and map these different practices that have emerged in different places, to try and learn from them. And then, I mean, Susan, your presentation made me think a lot, and I would need to probably rewatch it at a calmer time and kind of digest it more slowly. I do try and think a lot about, you know, toxic masculinity and how can we, you know, involve the guys in our struggle, to put it in an extremely blunt way. But so one question I sort of had is, you know, who who do you think is it that should be addressing this? Because there is, of course, a question of, who is it that talks about these vulnerable male professions and masculine forms of care, maybe, or whatever. So is this down to the feminists to do that, to the female feminists, or who is going to do that? So that was one thing that comes to mind, because I feel like I would love to see the subjects in question kind of address this and develop a politics out of this. So that relates somehow to the question of, how can some form of vulnerable masculinity win over toxic masculinity? Like, what conditions have to be given for that, or what? Like, do you have any hunches to kind of anything from discourses to specific situations to, I don't know, practices or labor context where that becomes possible somehow? Because with the way women are socialized, it's much easier for us to embrace an ethics of care, right? But and also what Selma, I think, was saying about protecting as caring made me think, maybe what is it? Can we valorize that still, or how can we valorize that? What possibilities are there for valorizing that and being that? Can that be a door opener for kind of other masculinities and so on, without going back to the classical kind of breadwinner, strong male protecting the weak family and so on model? So a lot of questions in there. I also ended up thinking, okay, I know social reproduction theory talks a lot more about, these kind of forms of wage work and so on than a lot of feminist theory does. So there's something to learn there also, of course. And of course, just one last thing was that, of course, the choice of whether you care for your family or the environment is a false choice, right? So also that has to be clearly pointed out. I mean, these choices need to be like undone somehow. So there's a lot of questions there, and I'd love to have like a very interesting conversation, and really interesting to hear also from Selma and Nina, from their kind of generational perspective and the struggles that you've been in and seen, over the years, of how that has been addressed. I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks a lot, Manuela. Yeah, that's also really interesting question you raised, and that's why it's also really nice that we have such a diverse panel and different age groups as well. Now we would like to continue with the Q&A, and herefore I would hand over to Corinna.
Yes, so hey, back from my side. We got some nice questions from the audience, and if you still have questions, please just write them to the chat box. Katie is going to check, and we're going to have some. But now first I'm going to use the privilege of being a moderator and raise an own question I've been carrying around for quite a while. So I think the question I have is mostly directed to Selma, Nina, and Manuela. So I've always been super impressed with the Wages for Housework campaign back in the 1970s that you, Selma, but also Silvia Federici can be said to be the founding mothers of. So now in her most recent book, Silvia Federici states that the two main goals of Wages for Housework, namely the reappropriation of common wealth and the disaccumulation of capital, are nowadays met mostly by commoning initiatives. So discussions around commoning care are very vivid in the degrowth spectrum. In FADA, there are many people working on it, myself included, and Manuela hasn't talked about it today, but she's working on childcare commons in Barcelona. So, and then on the other hand, like we have this proposal of a care income that you and Nina, together with our degrowth and FADA colleagues, Stefania and Giacomo, have put forward for the Green New Deal for Europe. So I feel that both proposals are in a way deeply complementary, but still they follow a bit of a different logic, while the care income in a way compensates for unpaid care work in monetary terms. Commoning initiatives would maybe rather call for policies that decouple social recognition from monetary income. such as, for example, by a universal basic income. So I guess in a nutshell, my question to the three of you is, how do you think that commoning care and the care income go together? And maybe in addition to Manuela, who's been working on the childcare commons, like what do you think, what are basic structures, institutions, policies that enables the flourishing of the commons? So maybe we can start with Selma.
Am I to speak? I'm sorry. I don't know. I'm not sure what commoning care means. If it means sharing the housework, we've tried that and it failed. That's why 20% of households, that was a splendid figure really, are now nuclear families. I'm not sure. I don't understand the word commoning really.
Maybe
can I add something to that? Because to me, I feel commoning is a bit trying to avoid the issue. Like somehow you're going to bypass capitalism rather than take capitalism on, which frankly is what has to be done. Capitalism has to be defeated. It can't really be bypassed.
But what do they mean by commoning?
Well, I don't know. It's some getting together. Yeah, maybe somebody can explain it. And then I'd like to say something about the basic income. But
yeah.
Maybe Manuela can talk briefly about the childcare commoning in Barcelona in like 2 or 3 sentences. And
what I would mean by commoning is people getting together, and we can talk about commoning care, but we can talk about commoning a lot of other things. Generally I would speak about a kind of self-managed organization of some form of labor or task. So if I would talk about childcare commoning, it's families getting together. In the instance of the things that I have been mostly researching, which Corinna has mentioned, it's self-organized creches, so parents groups that get together.
They do it all the time.
And organize their own spaces and modalities of childcare, either because they don't want to be in the mainstream public or private system, or because they cannot get places, or because they cannot afford it, or whatever. So many reasons there. Also very elitist forms of commoning, and other forms that are more grassroots and driven by kind of basic need, so there's a big spectrum there, I would say. And then, so commoning can be in any field. In my view, I think we need to do both things. We need to address the state and the market and the powers they wield over how we care. But I think we also need to establish kind of autonomous infrastructures that allow us some kind of respite and protection, and that can sustain us in periods where either the state or the market withdraw their support from. So that we build kind of power as social movements or as communities somehow. So I wouldn't talk about commoning as like something that happens within a nuclear family, and like that a husband and a wife are commoning if the husband is washing the dishes or something like this, obviously. But I don't know how much I should go into this, or if this was...
No, that's fine. The thing is, it seems to me more or less the same meaning as sharing. And people have done that forever. There have been all kinds of attempts to have local community, this and that. I remember I used to type for the BBC, and one of the producers had a whole community going, but it had nothing to do with what he was putting out on the BBC. He was a traditional person, and he had this additional thing. And I really feel that the best chance of raising children is being in the movement and incorporating them as much as they want to be incorporated into what the movement is doing and how the movement is viewing it, so that they get a rounded education that's less likely to be racist and sexist and homophobic, etc. I'm very nervous about people who have resources talking about sharing, which they've always had the right to do, and which does not it seems to me, unless I've missed something, does not very much move the movement forward, and we don't have a lot of time. We are up against the clock with the environment in all kinds of ways, and lunatics like Trump trampling about. And I think we must experiment with the way we relate and the way we raise our children, but we mustn't conflate that with political activity that confronts the powers that be and organizing to get that work done.
Can I add something to that in relation to the commoning and the sharing? Because, you know, in the third world, when you're in a poor community, you do not survive unless there's a lot of sharing going on. You share resources, you share the work. You know, the whole community is involved, especially if you're in a rural area, but not only. And I think that there's a way in which in the West that gets, which has no experience, not much of an experience of that then gets, you know, somehow glorified as the solution. And it isn't. The fact is, people need money. You know, caring is never going to be valued unless it is financially prioritized, and unless the women who do the work, and hopefully also men, actually are recognized for the work they're doing, so that you can see that this work is valued and prioritized by the society and the powers that be. Because otherwise it's all very well. Now there's a lot of clapping going on for the nurses and the doctors and the whatever, but there isn't much talk about increasing the nurses' wages and the women in the care homes, and let alone the mothers that are at home. You know, so it's, you know, we stay in the same place plus the clapping. You know, and that's not going to pay the bills, and it's not going to raise the status of caring, not really.
Can I quickly?
Yeah, I would. Yeah.
Sorry.
Manuela.
I mean, I don't think there is a way to have really one thing without the other. I think if you only have a care income, you could argue that the risk is that the women will stay, you know, now paid at the, you know, in front of the stove, or you have the same divisions of labor, but you know, now with a bit of money. So that the idea of commoning, obviously commoning means sharing, and it's as old as whatever, like totally agree. You know, that is also what, you know, Silvia Federici, etc. would argue about it. And of course, it can become a slightly fashionable thing in certain contexts, and that can be problematic. But I think it can also be really promising, because I think we are facing a lot of contexts of really strong individualization in, like, you know, industrialized countries, the West or whatever. Like, I mean, if I just talk about this kind of self-organized childcare initiatives that I've been very close to over these last years, they emerge because there's a lot of mothers that are stuck with their kids alone. And so these mothers, they get together, they organize, they have their shared childcare, and then they go to the 8th of March demo together. And then, you know, they circulate on their WhatsApp groups, all kinds of campaigns. It's a political space as well as a space of reproduction. And I think the articulation of these two things is very powerful, because we need to also have collectively empowering modes of care. And the state doesn't always offer that, right? I mean, that kind of invention comes out of the communities. So,
you know, I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding, because a care income doesn't mean that you're then stuck at home with your 1 or 2 or whatever kids. You know, I think once caring is valued as it should be and financially rewarded, then the whole idea of how you want to do the caring and who you want to do it with and what resources are needed for it, all that would be absolutely transformed. I mean, of course that we're all in Barcelona, when we had a women's center there was a whole initiative precisely like you described, of mothers, in fact, and fathers coming together to run a childcare basically, and being involved and all of that. In fact, little by little, what tended to happen is that then the wage worker ended up doing most of the childcare, in fact. But it was a very good initiative, and it was very good for the parents to be directly involved in how they wanted the childcare to be done, and to themselves have direct input. So it's not, it's not, one is not in contradiction with the other, but you just have got to have that money. When there was an MP, an independent MP, who fought for family allowance, which is child benefit here in England at the beginning of the last century, and yet there's no substitute. There was a whole debate about whether women should get, services instead of money in their hand and all that. And of course, you want all the services. But the money in your hand makes a lot of difference. You wouldn't suggest that the nurse or the doctor or the whatever should go and do it for free. And it does really make all the difference to your independence, to how you see your possibilities, to your ability to get together with others. It really transforms everything. It doesn't make you more individualistic. It doesn't have to. Women are stuck at home because they have no money usually.
Yeah, I would think that absolutely as a provocation, just to because my argument is obviously that these things should go together, right? It was just to say that it's nice for there to be an experimental field of practice that people can fall back on when they have the capacity. If that money buys them the time, it's nice that there are places and histories and practices they can draw on.
Okay, so we already see there's actually really a lot to discuss about the complementarity, and I also think what Nina said in the end, that it's really important to think those two things together, because having more self-organized care, collective care outside of heteronormative families also requires resources. So we have a couple of questions from the audience, which also go into the direction of the care income and commoning. And I'm going to start with those, and then we're going to have a quick answering round, and then we're going to turn to the more general questions which have been raised beforehand. So what we've been having here is Mark has been asking that given that capitalism won't deliver, do you, Selma and Nina, see a care income as akin to a transitional demand, or do you see it as a non-reformist reform or something completely else? And then also someone is asking to Selma and Nina, I agree that carers should be properly valued, but would this entrench caring further in the capitalist market economy, or perhaps further entrench the capitalist paradigm? So those are the two questions for the care income we have right now. And then afterwards, we're going to go to the more general questions. Nina and Selma, do you want to say something?
The question,
not a reformist demand, but a transitional demand.
I don't know if it's transitional demand or what.
Reformist. Non-reformist.
It depends on your movement, It's not anybody who decides, well, this is this kind of demand and this is another. If you have a movement, I saw the movement of single mothers in the US. I saw them surround the buildings of the social workers who had some say in how much money they had. And I saw the power that they wielded. I saw how clever they were, how organized, how aware of all the things that the state was spending money on to avoid giving money to their children. And, is that transitional? It's certainly transitional to women's power. Mm-hmm. But I don't think we should think in those old terms anymore. I think we should think of what can build the movement. That transitional and the other demands have to do with an organization that is top down. There's a man who has us in mind, and he has a number of women who are helping him, and he's ready to lead us from one transition in our low consciousness to another level of consciousness, which he has and we don't. I've been through it. I know the story, and we don't want that. We want a movement where people are creating each other and themselves and the struggle and their children, and they're making international connections, which leaves their parents and grandparents far behind. A movement, you know, it doesn't happen very often. I was absolutely lucky that I was born in the movement of the 30s, which people don't know about. Anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-war, anti-Hitler. You know, it was tremendous. That was my childhood. What an education. Then I had the 60s. I saw again people open their minds to sexual choices and to racism and to the international movement for liberation. There was the biggest movement the world had seen up to then of independence movement and the end of the empires, which of course they ended and they came back again. We know about that. But a movement is another kind of life, which this generation has only begun to experience. And it is another world from the one we know. Transitional demands have no place. What has a place is today you think this, but tomorrow you want more because you have 20 other people with you. And you are constantly expanding in your possibilities and in what you think needs changing. And the Black Lives Matter has given a go-ahead to a movement everywhere, which is taking root. I don't know what's going to happen. I have no idea, but it gives you a taste of people ready to go and to fight for what they believe. And what they believe changes, you know. They think differently of women, men do, and men think differently, and women think differently of men and of children, and people, different races think differently of each other because they open themselves to another level of power which they didn't think they'd ever have. So I think we should start to think more about building a movement which is not based on stages of consciousness of other people. Let's concentrate on our own consciousness. We need help. I feel I do. I'm learning every minute during this meeting here.
Thanks a lot, Selma. Very, very insightful. I have a question here for which I'm going to direct mostly to Susan and Anna. So Emma has been saying we've heard a lot about the opportunities the pandemic opens for establishing systemic change because it helps to reveal or uncover all the ways in which the current system is broken. But that presumes that the problem was a lack of understanding or knowledge on that, when so many of us have been saying this for decades. So is the real problem not that power dynamics, whereby it's a very blatantly make all the decisions which remains unchanged, or is it only exacerbated by the current crisis? So what strategies do you, Susan and Anna, suggest to achieve change at this particular time that lies outside the realm of person knowledge? Building awareness, awareness raising, and inside the realm of taking action and taking really a shift in power away from the very few. What are your suggested future steps? Maybe Susan can start.
Okay. Well, I know Anna's thought deeply about this. First of all of the uprising of forms of common care and response to COVID and the revealing of inequalities, that's not going to change anything. The powers that are pushing to defend status quo unequal systems are much, much greater than these new little glimpses of knowledge and experiences of collaborating to help our neighbors. It's going to require enormous struggle across differently positioned people and people with different theoretical and political visions that need to come together and fight, I think, through through political movements, through street movements, and also through changing our own private lives and institutions in all kinds of ways. So I think Anna also has more on that.
Yes, I agree with Susan that uncovering things and uncovering more things isn't changing anything. However, and the problem is actually power dynamics, and we could trace this argument maybe back to Gramsci, who has made the point of like there is a hegemonic bloc, and if this, like, as long as this bloc of common interests in preserving the status quo is not changed, then the situation won't change. And who changes that? Who has the capacity to change such a hegemonic bloc, maybe? So. And knowing this, it can be very frustrating to engage in the business of uncovering as we are doing now. And I think still it is so important that we do that, because I have this from John Powell, who is in African American Studies at Berkeley. He is talking about the stories we live by. And as long as we keep uncovering, I think we have the power to change the stories we live by. And it remains important, although it doesn't change anything. But it is important to start with maybe following a different trail. And more practically speaking, in the statement we mentioned kinship networks, odd kin in Haraway's words. Also, Nina and Selma have contributed so many practical insights about strategies, and this is action, although it might be futile. When seeing how much of this resistance is actually not going very far because other powers are so strong. And then the question is, where does solidarity come from if we want to continue in this project, if we want to continue uncovering and not just turn our heads away? Where does the solidarity come from? And I think within the pandemic, there is a discussion or a conversation that has started that might help us also in Haraway's words, staying with the trouble. And I think what helps is trauma healing, and also intergenerational trauma healing. For example, indigenous peoples invest a lot of time in healing from genocide, as well as other groups have invested in other trauma healing processes. And I think this is important. It will maybe offer us a skill set to continue. And even though maybe actions at some points in time may be out of reach or may seem very far, it is important to follow the thread. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Anna. So I got here a question for Manuela. So someone in the audience was very interested in your mention of the practices and rhythms that would allow us to sustain caretaking. So women are trained in the skills of providing family and house care from childhood, but capitalism does not train anyone in environmental and societal care. So do you have any ideas, Manuela, on how this kind of training can begin and what it would look like and where it might already exist?
Huge question. I read it and I thought about it. I mean, from the way I understood the questions, it's not about training in the sense of schools, but more like training in everyday life, right? Because there is the question of what kind of educational strategies there are in relation to that. That would be one kind of conversation that I'm also very interested in. I don't really have a very good answer to that. I mean, I think that there are more and more, or at least I'm finding people writing about social movements in terms of kind of intergenerational process of passing on knowledges and so on within feminism, but also through other social movements. And I'm finding that that really useful for kind of acknowledging the importance of passing on knowledges through different, generations within movements. So in that sense, very nice also to have the panel like this today with people from different places and generations. To a certain extent, I guess the experience of being vulnerable is something that alerts us a lot to different kinds of you know, bodily and natural rhythms, from like anything from vulnerability to natural, you know, disasters or events, or also illness, any, you know, pollution, etc. I mean, we're all becoming more aware of our vulnerability these days, if we haven't already been, I guess. So that's an opportunity, but very concrete tools. I'd love to talk about that more, but I can't like give you a really good answer. One thing can I just mention one quick thing, because there was a question earlier about structures that enable this, the flourishing of commoning, just to come back to that for 1 second. And it's mentioned a lot, but I think looking at the municipalism that's happening in Barcelona right now, and the way that the people that have gone from social movements into municipalist institutions are kind of managing to foster both the public system and what kind of care needs to be provided by the public system, in that case the municipal kind of structures of care, and the neighborhood-based initiatives, and seeing those two not as a contradiction. This is the thing that makes Barcelona an extremely exciting and promising kind of case to learn from right now, because those two things do not need to be in contradiction. And I think so, as long as we keep thinking them as an absolute contradiction, we are stuck. So that's just...
Thank you, Manuela. Thanks. Susan wanted to add something here.
Yes, thank you, Karina. I love this question. How can we learn about societal and ecological care? Is a wonderful question. I think already our societies have a marvelous diversity of forms and dynamics for caregiving that include environmental and social care, especially in non-Western communities all over the world. There's so many different ways to do it. I love that Selma points out, you'd never guess from politicians the diversity of ways people live and look after each other. And I think my little images from COVID, public health images show that it's so stereotypical. It doesn't, and also many feminist messages, they don't show us where we can learn about those things. So I just want to connect this to some other things we've been talking about. Includes the data of how we live. Demographers organize census data into household types. In most countries, nuclear families defined as one man, one woman, and at least one children, regardless of marital status or anything else. So in the 2010 census in the US, there was just under 19% of those, just under 20%. In the Caribbean, there's less. And in South America, a little bit more, but still less than 25%. And it's funny that people learn about caring and community in all kinds of ways, not just the nuclear family, right? That's not the only place to learn it. And I'm really worried about the fact that all OECD countries, almost all, the largest household type is one person living alone. That creates, it's incredibly wasteful ecologically. Every single house has its own heater, its own washing machine, its own TV, its own everything, right? But also it keeps us from practicing every day the challenges and the joys of common care, right? Of fighting over who's cooking, of looking after the kids, all of that common thing, and also of intergenerational learning. By the way, which I love what we're doing right now. I just love being amongst younger and older people together, learning and thinking about those things. And there's
Susan, you're muted.
Sorry, that degrowth have been exploring wonderful options for co-living, for co-housing, for co-provisioning, for common child care, where people are experimenting and strengthening strategies for caring together, which I think are beautiful places to learn about environmental and societal care that, again, are outside the traditional sort of nuclear family, the model that the man cares by earning cash and the woman cares by raising the kids, which just isn't the reality. So the answer is to learn from the wonderful realities they're already sort of thriving and to support those. Thank you.
Did you want to say, cool?
Thank you, Susan. Thanks. So we're almost there. We don't have so much time any longer, but I want to close with a question well, basically it's two questions. It's one specifically for Selma and then a very general one for all of you. So it's a specific one to Selma is, would you elaborate, Selma, on your comments about Black women and welfare you made in your input? And then we have the general question to all speakers, like now after COVID, like what policies should we be advocating for, like job protections, paid caretaking, or like are there any next steps you see? And linking to the question about Black feminism, how would you suggest feminist economists show solidarity for the Black Lives Matter in the US? So at this point, I would also like to mention that on Wednesday, like tomorrow, we're having another session on Indigenous and Black communities and the impact of COVID, which I think will be very interesting to watch. But I want to hand over to the wrap up by Katie after each of you speakers had one chance to talk about Black Lives Matter and your future steps. And I would want to start with Selma.
In the 1940s and 50s, there was a welfare movement, and it was the heart of it. What we're particularly interested in was called AFDC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children.
It was in the US.
This was in the United States. Roosevelt had something to do with the beginnings of this, and then he died, and we moved on to others. And then what happened is, according to one racist, racists can be useful if they give us some figures because they're so anxious for us to have it and they don't know that we can benefit from it. The women, there is a graph where the women went up equally. Women, non-white women, he calls them, went up in their AFDC as Black men's unemployment went up. But at a certain point, Black men's unemployment went down, and the aid to families with dependent children kept going up, which meant the women had left the men, or at least were seeking an income for themselves without reference to them. And they formed a movement, which I saw in action in a visit, but I read about it and met the people later who had been leading it and had been involved in it. And there were many thousands of women, well, probably millions of women involved, and they established their right to have money to feed their children without having to take a job outside the home. They were very organized. They were very collective. They met a lot and determined how they would act. They came out at particular moments in mobilizations. One of them I saw where they had put a man on the moon and they said, the moon don't wear clothes, but our children do, and they need a clothing allowance. And the first response of the feminists, this was in Detroit in 1969, was the leadership was not good. Well, I have to tell you, the leadership was excellent. And many of them, those mothers, a woman in our network, Margaret Prescott, worked as a teacher at that time in Ocean Hill, Brownsville in Brooklyn, New York, which was a hotbed of anti-racism. And she worked with those mothers, and she said they were the cleverest and the most determined, and they had plenty of time to fight for their children. Please note that, to do caring, you have to have time away from waged work. And there are a couple of books that you may want to know. And Johnny Tillman was a woman who said that if I were president, I would give every woman who had a family wages for housework for that work, and we would see a lot of things change, etc. This is written, you can get it elsewhere. They finally educated Martin Luther King on what the story was with women, which helped to shape the Poor People's Campaign of 1968, which was being launched as he was murdered. They still exist, some of them, and they have come out for a care income and a universal basic income. That is, everybody should have a basic income, but women should have an income that acknowledges their work and pays for it.
Thanks a lot, Selma, for this final statement. Nina, do you want to say some final words?
No, it's all right. You go ahead. She just said it for me.
Okay. So, Susan, do you want to say some final words on how you suggest we show solidarity for Black Lives Matter, or your future steps?
No, thanks. I think I'll cede the time. I've already tried to bring my ideas together in that last statement.
How about Anna?
Yeah, I'm thinking about the question that you raised after COVID, what policies should we be advocating for? And I'm going to speak possibly from a very German position, because I will address the state, which is still a relevant actor in my region. I think it is important to make tax systems less unfair for single parents and to make them more fair for people who are carrying a heavy care burden. It is important to internationally make sure that corporations can't evade taxes and to reduce tax havens, because this actually might give us some leverage on things to redistribute to other places. And finally, to divest, to make sure that there are state regulations against the investment in nuclear and fossil energies.
Thank you, Anna. This was very concise, and yeah, thank you. And Manuela, your final words. Manuela?
Yeah, I'm only going to say thank you as well. If anybody has links to inspiring kind of educational or kind of practices of that resonate with any of the things that have been said, I'm quite interested, especially following up on this question that that Stephanie has posed, which is very difficult to answer. I'm happy to get inspired if people want to post something in the chat. And thanks a lot for organizing.
Sorry, can I add one thing? I'm sorry. In relation to Black Lives Matter, it's a piece of information that the Global Women's Strike has been very involved going to the demonstrations, and also putting together, women of color in the Global Women's Strike have put together a whole set of demands as they relate to the police, but also to economic justice, etc., which if people are interested, we could definitely circulate that.
Thanks a lot, Selma, and I'm handing over to Katie for the session closing.
Thank you. Yeah, as we are a little bit over time, so I will keep it really, really short. And I just wanted to quickly close and a warm thank you again to all our speakers for this really interesting debate. And yeah, we would be very happy if discussions would continue. Also, a big thank you to all of our participants and the thought-provoking and interesting questions that we have received today. And yes, for everyone who would like to get in touch with FADA, so please feel free to send us an email, and you can also join our mailing list, which I have already put in the chat box. And as Corinna has mentioned in the beginning, we understand FADA is an open and inclusive network, so we are always looking forward to welcome new members.